this is Dion. Today we'll be discussing cellular transport, which really means transport means how materials are going to move into the cell and out of the cell. So again, cellular transport is basically having to do with homeostasis. In order to maintain homeostasis or an internal balance inside an organism, you have to be able to get nutrients and materials into the cell and waste products out of the cell to maintain that balance. So we'll be looking at different ways that the cells in the body do this. There's two types of cellular transport. The first type is called passive, and just like the word passive suggests, there's no energy required for this type of transport. So it really just happens kind of naturally. The cell is not expending energy to do this. And the reason is because the molecules move from a high concentration to a low concentration. So really that just means they move to where the molecules are very packed to an area where they're less densely packed. And that's a natural way molecules want to move, so it does not require energy. So still considering passive transport, these are some types of passive transport. We have simple diffusion, which is where the molecules simply will move from where there's a high concentration of them to a low concentration through the cell membrane. So again, it's going from where there's a lot of molecules to less molecules, either into the cell or out of the cell. And here's a model showing you these green blobs here represent the molecules. So they're going from where there's lots of them to where there are less through the cell membrane here. We also have facilitated diffusion. This is still passive transport. The molecules are doing the same thing, going from where there's a lot to less, but they're moving through transport proteins in the cell membrane. So they'll be going, these water molecules here are going from where there's lots to where there's less, but they're moving through this purple structure, which represents a transport protein. So that's called facilitated diffusion because they're being helped or facilitated through here by this transport protein. The third type of passive transport is called osmosis. Osmosis is simply the movement of water from where there's lots to where there's less. So it's very similar to simple diffusion. We have three types of solutions that our cells can sit in. The first is called isotonic. Iso means equal. So this is where you will have equal amounts of water inside the cell and outside. And even though it's equal, the molecules are still constantly moving, but they may just be changing positions. So if you have 4 inside, you have 4 outside, but they're constantly switching with each other to maintain that balance. This is a red blood cell in an isotonic solution, which is what a normal red blood cell should look like. Hypotonic solution is where water moves into the cell. A lot of students remember this because they think hypo sounds like hippo, which would be very large. So in this one, the cell swells and gets very large because you're pumping water into the cell and it's expanding. This is showing a red blood cell in a hypotonic solution, and the red blood cell is very puffed up in this picture. Hypertonic solution is the opposite of hypotonic, where water is going to move out of the cell. So the cell kind of shrinks down because the water, it's just like letting the water out of a water balloon. It will shrink down. These are cells in a hypertonic solution, especially with this one here. You can really see how they're kind of shrunken in as opposed to the other two pictures we just saw. Okay, the second type of transport of how things are going to go into or out of the cell is called active transport. So all of those other we just talked about were passive. They required no energy. This is active. It does require energy to occur. So really what you have going on here is molecules moving from where there's less or a low concentration to a high concentration. So it's really against their natural motion, so it does require energy. Here's our different types of active transport. This is really just active transport where the molecules will move from where there's less to where there's more. These two are also active, but they're a little different This might involve one-celled organisms that may do this. Endocytosis is a way of actually engulfing or taking in one large particle, which also requires energy. And exocytosis is like exiting or leaving, so it's expelling or getting rid of a large particle, which is a little different than what we talked about right here, but it's considered active transport because it requires energy. So this would be like an amoeba or something getting rid of waste. It just pushes it out through the cell membrane, which requires energy. Here's an example of active transport. So this hydrogen ion is going from where there's 1 to where there's 5 on this side. So this requires energy to go through this process. This ATP here represents the energy being used to make that process occur. These two diagrams are showing us, A up here is showing us endocytosis, where those large particles are coming into and becoming a part of the cell through the cell membrane. And B here is showing the particles being expelled. So this one will be exocytosis. And even though it's a little different than the previous picture we just saw, it requires energy for the cell to do these processes. And then this is just a question that I would ask if this is passive or active transport. If this line represented the cell membrane and I had 4 molecules on this side and I had 8 molecules on this side, if this would be passive or active transport. And the answer to this one is this would be active transport because it's going from less on this side to more on this side. And that concludes our presentation on cellular transport.